Lorenzo Rossi gripped the controls as the sun rose over Naples, and for the first time, he wondered if obeying orders could ever be worth the lives it might destroy. The sky above the city was alive with shifting clouds, the morning light catching rooftops, spires, and the bustling streets below, and Lorenzo, barely 23, felt a weight pressing down on him heavier than the engines roaring beneath his Savoia Marchetti SM-79. The mission was clear: drop the bombs over Naples, weaken the enemy, demonstrate Italy's power. But every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that the city beneath him was the place he had grown up in, the place his family lived, where children ran through markets and laughed in sunlit piazzas. And he remembered his mother pinning his jacket on the first day of flight school, his father's steady voice telling him to always serve with honor, and now honor seemed a distant concept, meaningless if measured by the destruction of one's own home. He glanced at his navigator, Enrico, scribbling coordinates into a map, unaware of the storm raging in Lorenzo's mind, the internal battle that had nothing to do with strategy or politics, only with the choice between duty and conscience, between obeying orders and protecting life. And for the first time, he realized that true courage was not in following instructions, but in making impossible decisions, alone, in silence, with the entire weight of consequence on his shoulders. The engines roared, shaking the plane, and the bombs sat heavy in their racks, a physical reminder of the choice he had to make. And as he traced familiar streets below, imagined the bustling market where he had bought oranges with his mother, the fountain where he and his sister had thrown coins and made wishes, he felt a sharp, almost unbearable tension. One wrong move could mean death, but any other move could mean betrayal of everything he loved. And yet, despite fear that clutched his chest, he nudged the controls, steering the plane away from the harbor over less populated hills, each second stretching into eternity, every heartbeat a drum of rebellion against orders that demanded destruction. And Enrico noticed, whispered, "Lorenzo, what are you doing?" But he could only shake his head, unable to speak the truth, that loyalty to humanity outweighed loyalty to commands, that obedience could never justify killing innocents. And as the miles passed, Naples remained untouched, alive, the streets, rooftops, and children preserved. And the relief that should have felt pure was laced with guilt, knowing that elsewhere others were not as fortunate, that war demanded cruel choices at every turn. When they landed, the base was oblivious. Officers filed reports, noted coordinates, unaware of the moral victory that had occurred in silence above the city. And Lorenzo stepped out into the sunlight, carrying in his chest a secret heavier than any metal, a quiet defiance that would shape him, haunt him, and guide every decision to come. As Italy plunged deeper into war, alliances grew more dangerous, and the skies he would soon navigate became theaters of moral reckoning, each flight a test of conscience, courage, and survival. And in that quiet moment, with the city breathing safely beneath him, he realized that the war was only beginning, and that every choice, every mission, would demand the same impossible balance between duty and humanity, and that the true measure of a man was not in medals or obedience, but in the courage to act rightly when no one else is watching.
The sun had barely risen over the hangar when Lorenzo Rossi stepped out, the faint metallic scent of fuel and oil thick in the morning air. And though Naples lay safe beneath the clouds he had flown over days ago, the weight of what he had done pressed on him heavier than any mission briefing or officer's order could. And the base itself felt different now, alive with chatter and movement, but alien, as though he had returned from a world the others could not see, a world where morality and duty collided in ways that could not be explained in maps or military manuals. And soon new orders arrived, reconnaissance flights over the Adriatic, missions that seemed harmless on paper, but Lorenzo's chest tightened with unease, for even in these routine assignments, the lives of men, women, and children would pass beneath his wings, and he felt the same tension in his stomach that had seized him over Naples, only now amplified by the knowledge that the war was expanding, that Italy was plunging ever deeper into alliances with a Germany he neither fully trusted nor understood. And as he climbed into the cockpit, the engines thrummed beneath him like a heartbeat that was not his own, each vibration a reminder that the sky had become a theater of choices, and as he lifted off, the coastline shrinking beneath him, the wind pressing against his face, he could not stop replaying every moment of his previous flight. The innocent streets, the laughter of children, the markets and fountains that had remained untouched, and he realized that every decision now carried not only physical danger, but the moral weight of his conscience. And over the Adriatic, the blue expanse seemed both serene and threatening, a silent jury for every choice he might make. And when he reached the first checkpoint, scanning for enemy activity, the sun glinting off the waves, he noticed the flicker of a fishing boat far below, unaware of the war, unaware that above them, a young Italian pilot struggled with the question of obedience versus humanity. And in that moment, the sky felt impossibly vast and intimate at once, the world below both a canvas and a battlefield, and the hours stretched endlessly, each maneuver, each calculation, forcing Lorenzo to confront the tension between survival and morality, duty and conscience, until by the time he returned to base, the sun was dipping low, painting the tarmac in blood red and gold, and the officers noted mission success, charts logged and radio reports filed. But Lorenzo stepped out of the plane carrying an invisible weight far heavier than any medal or commendation. For he had learned that obedience could be easy, but courage, the kind that preserved life and soul, demanded endurance, reflection, and at times defiance. And as nights fell, filled with distant explosions, the hum of engines, and the quiet conversations of men who did not yet understand the war's true cost, Lorenzo found himself writing in his journal, mapping not coordinates or targets, but the contours of fear, guilt, and hope within his own heart. And each word, each line, was a tether to humanity, a small rebellion against the forces that sought to reduce men to tools. And as the days passed, new missions took him further north and east, over unfamiliar lands where the Adriatic met mountains, rivers, and villages he could only glimpse from above, and every flight became a meditation on choice, consequence, and survival. And in the rare moments of calm, when engines cooled and the night sky stretched infinite above him, Lorenzo understood that the war was teaching him something no instructor or manual ever could, that the courage to act rightly, the strength to follow one's conscience, and the will to preserve life amidst chaos were lessons he would carry forever. And as Italy moved deeper into battle, alliances shifting, enemy positions changing, and the world grew ever more dangerous, Lorenzo Rossi felt the rising storm not just in the sky, but inside himself, a relentless, unyielding test of morality, bravery, and endurance. And he knew that the choices he made in these quiet hours above the Adriatic would echo in the missions to come, shaping not only his fate, but the man he was becoming in a war that demanded more than skill. It demanded soul.
The roar of distant artillery shook the thin canvas walls of the camp, rattling Lorenzo's thoughts as he adjusted his flight jacket, the desert wind carrying grit into every seam, and for the first time since leaving Naples, the war felt tangible, brutal, and unrelenting, not as orders on paper, but as scorching sun, biting sand, and the invisible threat lurking in every horizon. And as he walked toward his plane, the Savoia Marchetti gleaming under the harsh light, his stomach churned with anticipation, dread, and the creeping awareness that every mission now could be the last, that every flight over the endless dunes of North Africa was a gamble where skill met fate in a deadly dance. And while the other pilots moved with practiced confidence, jokes and banter masking fear, Lorenzo's mind replayed Naples, the streets he had spared, the children running through sunlit markets, and he wondered if sparing lives in one moment meant he could endure the carnage looming in the desert, the convoys that vanished into dust and gunfire, the villages scorched in the name of strategy, the lives that depended on split-second decisions in the cockpit. And as he climbed aboard, the engines thundering beneath him, he felt the familiar tension of responsibility, the moral weight pressing like the sun overhead. And as the plane lifted off, the earth falling away beneath him, the desert stretching endlessly, he scanned the terrain, noting ridges, convoys, and distant smoke, each sight a reminder that life and death were intertwined here, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the discipline to act despite it. And the first sortie brought it all into sharp relief. A column of enemy vehicles hidden among dunes, their movements precise, deadly, and as he maneuvered over them, adrenaline twisting his stomach, he realized that no amount of training could prepare a man for this, for the moral calculus of war, where every choice meant someone lived and someone died. and returning to base, engines cooling, dust clinging to his uniform, Lorenzo found brief comfort in shared silence with his comrades, a quiet acknowledgement of survival, but no words could erase the images burned into his mind, the knowledge that each day here demanded more than skill, it demanded heart, conscience, and the courage to remain human amidst chaos. And over the following weeks, sorties became longer, missions more complex, the desert relentless in its demands, and Lorenzo discovered the fragile threads that kept him tethered, whispered warnings of ambushes, small gestures of kindness, letters from home tucked into uniforms, moments of humor, fleeting but luminous against the endless sand, and in these he found hope, a reason to endure, to steer the plane with steady hands even as fear clawed at his chest. And though the desert sun beat down mercilessly, though comrades fell and the wind carried dust like specters, Lorenzo clung to the lessons of Naples, the quiet defiance, the courage to spare life, the moral compass that refused to bend. And as night fell, painting the dunes in silver and shadow, he traced lines in his journal not of strategy, but of conscience, of choices, of courage in moments when the world demanded surrender. And he knew that this was only the beginning, that the desert was a crucible, and every flight, every heartbeat, every decision would forge him, teaching him that survival was not enough, that humanity itself had to be protected, even amidst the sand, the heat, and the thunder of war echoing endlessly across the horizon.
When Lorenzo first saw the Italian coastline again, it was through a haze of smoke and disbelief, a land both familiar and foreign, scarred by a war that had devoured everything it touched. And as his transport descended toward the airfield near Naples, the city he had once spared from his own bombs lay wounded now by others, its skyline fractured, its people moving like ghosts among ruins, and he felt a strange guilt twist through them, as though by saving it once he had only delayed its suffering. And stepping onto the tarmac, the air smelled not of salt and sea, but of ash and decay, the heavy scent of a nation breaking under its own weight. And word spread quickly through the base. Mussolini had fallen, Italy had surrendered, and the Germans were moving south with cold precision, turning yesterday's allies into tomorrow's enemies. And in that instant, the war became something else entirely. Not a conflict between nations, but a struggle for survival within one's own home. And Lorenzo, who had once flown under the proud insignia of the Regia Aeronautica, found himself wearing a uniform that now marked him as both target and traitor, hunted by the very men who had once called him comrade. And the days that followed were chaos. Officers burning documents, soldiers abandoning posts, civilians flooding roads in desperate attempts to flee the advancing German columns. And amidst it all, Lorenzo wandered through the shattered streets of Naples, searching for meaning in the wreckage, finding children scavenging for food, mothers clutching what little they had left, old men staring silently at the sky as if it might still offer mercy. And it was there, among the ruins, that he began to understand what the desert had tried to teach him, that war was not about lines drawn on maps or speeches shouted through radios, but about human beings caught in the machinery of fear. And as the Germans took control of the city, their boots echoing down narrow alleys, he realized he had to choose again, not between orders and defiance this time, but between self-preservation and the moral instinct that had guided him since that first flight over Naples. And when he saw a young boy beaten by soldiers for stealing bread, the sound of the whip cracking through the air, something inside Lorenzo broke. The discipline, the fear, the caution, all of it shattered, and he intervened without thought, striking the soldier, chaos erupting around him, shouts, gunfire, pain flashing through his arm as he fled into the maze of the city, his breath ragged, heart pounding. And as he hid among the ruins, bleeding and trembling, he knew there was no going back, that he was no longer a pilot, no longer a soldier of any army, but a fugitive in his own homeland. And when night fell, he found refuge in the cellar of a bombed-out house, its walls cracked, the air thick with dust and memory, and by candlelight he wrote in his journal again, not of missions or skies or tactics, but of people, faces, voices, the small acts of courage that still flickered amidst the horror.
and he swore that if he could not fight for Italy from the air, he would fight for it from the ground, for its people, its dignity, its chance to rise again from the ashes. And as the city slept uneasily under the iron grip of occupation, Lorenzo Rossi closed his eyes and listened to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore, a rhythm older than war itself, a reminder that even in ruin, life continued, and somewhere within that fragile persistence, he found the strength to endure, to hide, to survive, and perhaps one day to fight again, not for flags or leaders, but for what was left of his soul.
The first night Lorenzo met the resistance, the air was thick with mistrust and the smell of rain-soaked stone, and the faces that studied him across the dimly lit cellar were carved with suspicion, men and women hardened by loss, by hunger, by the kind of courage that comes only after despair. And though he wore no insignia now, they saw in him the remnants of the old order, a pilot, once sworn to the regime they despised, and for a long, uneasy silence, no one spoke, until an older man with a rifle leaning against his chair simply asked, "Why are you here?" And Lorenzo, still bandaged from his wound, replied not with excuses, but with a truth so raw it silenced the room, "Because I can't pretend anymore." And in that moment, something shifted, not fully trust, but the faint beginning of it, and he was allowed to stay, to listen, to learn. And in the weeks that followed, he became one of them, not by rank or authority, but by shared necessity, by the common understanding that survival was rebellion enough, and the city around them had become a living wound, every street a potential ambush, every whisper a risk. And by day Lorenzo helped gather supplies, forge papers, and deliver coded messages through the war-torn alleys, his former discipline as a pilot repurposed into quiet precision, while by night he found himself haunted by dreams of the desert, of burning skies, of faces he could no longer remember but could never forget. And though the resistance operated in shadows, it was not the darkness that frightened him most. It was the fragility of the light they fought to preserve, the way a single act of betrayal could unravel everything. And one evening, as the group planned a sabotage on a German supply convoy, Lorenzo noticed the nervous glance of a young member, a boy no older than 17, his hands shaking as he folded the map, and something in his eyes spoke of guilt, of fear, of secrets too heavy to bear. And Lorenzo felt a chill crawl up his spine, the unmistakable scent of betrayal lingering like smoke. And though he said nothing, his instincts sharpened, his thoughts racing, and when the mission unfolded 2 nights later, his worst fear became reality. The ambush came not from the road, but from behind. German trucks roaring out of the darkness, gunfire cutting through the night like lightning, screams and chaos swallowing the careful rhythm of their plan. And Lorenzo ran through the smoke and blood, dragging a wounded comrade to safety, his lungs burning, his mind numb with disbelief. And when dawn came, only half of them returned to the cellar, the rest gone, captured, killed, or vanished into the silence of occupied Naples. And in the heavy quiet that followed, the group's leader spoke only one name, the boy, missing since the night before. And though no one needed to say it, they all knew, and in that moment, Lorenzo understood the cruel arithmetic of resistance, that heroism and betrayal often shared the same table, that courage was sometimes born from loss, and that trust, once broken, could never fully mend. And yet, even as grief hollowed them, they continued, because to stop would mean surrender, and to surrender would mean forgetting why they had chosen to fight at all. And late that night, sitting beside the candle's flicker, Lorenzo opened his journal again, hands trembling, and wrote not of missions or strategy, but of the strange, persistent flame of defiance that still burned within him, fragile but alive. And he realized that in this war without uniforms, without clear lines or orders, he had finally found something worth fighting for. Not pride, not revenge, but the belief that even in shadows, humanity could still resist the darkness. And as he closed the notebook and listened to the distant hum of planes overhead, he whispered a quiet promise to the fallen, to the betrayed, and to himself, that he would endure long enough to see the light return, no matter how faint or far away it seemed.
Rain fell like ash that night, cold and relentless, drumming against the ruins as Lorenzo Rossi led his small resistance group through the outskirts of Naples.
The air was thick with smoke and fear, the kind that clings to the lungs and makes silence feel louder than gunfire. Their mission was madness. Destroy the railway bridge at San Giorgio, the artery that fed the German front lines. But desperation had long replaced reason. Lorenzo had drawn the plan himself, the same precision he once used to chart skies, now guiding men through shadows. Every face around him carried exhaustion, but also trust in him. It was heavier than his rifle, heavier than the memory of every man he'd already lost. When they reached the bridge, the storm swallowed their whispers. Lightning tore across the horizon, revealing steel, wire, and water below. For one fragile moment, hope felt real. Then came the flare, white light exploding in the sky, followed by the guttural shouts of German soldiers. Gunfire erupted. The quiet plan shattered into chaos. Men dove for cover as bullets ricocheted off stone. Lorenzo crawled through the mud, blood pounding in his ears, the detonator slick in his shaking hands. A bullet struck near his leg, sending shards of rock into his face. But he didn't stop. He pressed the charge, and the bridge vanished in a roar of light and smoke. The explosion hurled him backward, the air torn from his lungs. When he opened his eyes, all he could hear was ringing. All he could see was fire. The bridge was gone. Victory, if it could be called that, burned before him. Two of his men lay nearby, one lifeless, the other staring at him with the hollow shock of survival. Lorenzo dragged the wounded man back through the rain, his body trembling, his mind numb. By the time he reached the cellar, dawn was bleeding through the cracks in the walls. The others called him a hero. He didn't feel like one. The bridge was gone, yes, but so were pieces of his soul. Sitting alone in the flicker of a dying candle, Lorenzo realized that leadership wasn't about command. It was about carrying the weight of those who couldn't anymore. And as he closed his eyes, the echo of the explosion still roaring in his skull, he understood that courage wasn't something you were born with. It was something that survived inside you, even after everything else had burned away.
By the summer of 1944, the sound of war had changed. It was no longer distant thunder. It was here, echoing through the valleys as Allied forces pushed north. Naples, the city Lorenzo once refused to bomb, was breathing again, though each breath seemed to scrape against the dust and ruins. Streets that had been silent now trembled with the footsteps of people returning, faces pale but alive. The air carried a strange mix of smoke, rain, and fragile hope. For Lorenzo, that hope felt foreign, almost dangerous. He had lived too long with fear as his only compass. Now, watching German convoys retreat through the hills, he felt the world shifting, but inside, he was still trapped somewhere between guilt and survival. He and his small band of partisans had spent the last months sabotaging supply lines, guiding refugees through the countryside, and hiding from soldiers who were running out of mercy. The lines between victory and vengeance blurred more with each passing week. The Germans were leaving, yes, but they left nothing untouched. Mines buried under fields, villages burned to ash, and families executed for sheltering resistance fighters. Every kilometer of regained land felt haunted. At night, Lorenzo sat with his men around dying fires, their faces flickering in the half-light, their laughter hollow. They all spoke about freedom, but none of them knew what it meant anymore. When the flames burned low, the silence between them said more than words could. One evening, while scavenging through the ruins of a bombed cathedral, Lorenzo found a shard of stained glass, still shining faintly through the dust. He turned it over in his hand, and the fractured colors painted his fingers blue and gold. For a moment, he saw his reflection in it, scattered, unrecognizable. The young pilot who once believed in honor and country was gone. What remained was a man shaped by loss, still moving forward because stopping meant facing everything he'd buried. When the Allies finally entered Naples, the city erupted in joy. Flags waved, church bells rang for the first time in years, and music spilled into the streets. People cried,
hugged strangers, and shouted words that once would have gotten them killed. But Lorenzo couldn't bring himself to join them. He stood at a distance, watching the celebration unfold like a memory he didn't belong to. A British officer approached him, thanking him, calling him a hero. Lorenzo nodded, forcing a small smile, but inside he felt nothing. Heroism, he thought, was something invented by those who hadn't seen what it cost. When night fell, he climbed the hill above the city, the same place he once looked down from in his plane. Now the sea below shimmered with moonlight instead of fire. Naples was free, or at least beginning to be. The wind was soft again, carrying the faint sound of laughter instead of screams. Lorenzo closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of salt and smoke, and whispered quietly to the ghosts that had followed him through every mission, every night of doubt and terror. "We're almost there."
Winter came to Italy like a quiet predator. Cold winds cutting through the ruins of Naples and the surrounding hills, and Lorenzo Rossi felt it in his bones long before he saw it on the ground. The Germans were retreating, the Allies advancing steadily, but the city still carried the scars of months of war. The streets littered with rubble, abandoned belongings, and silent reminders of those who had vanished. Every morning, Lorenzo walked through neighborhoods half swallowed by ash, greeting civilians with tired smiles, offering what little food or comfort he could, yet the weight of survival never lifted from his shoulders. Nights were worse. Fires from Allied bombardments still flickered on distant horizons, and the screams of the wounded sometimes drifted into the silence, a haunting counterpoint to the rare laughter he caught among liberated children. Lorenzo's role had changed. He was no longer just a pilot, no longer only a resistance fighter. He had become a witness, a reluctant protector, someone whose conscience could not turn away from the suffering around him. He moved with careful precision, guiding refugees, marking safe paths, disarming mines left behind by fleeing soldiers, and in every act he carried the memory of those lost in the desert, the betrayed boy, the friends who had fallen in missions that should have been simple. But winter forced him to confront another truth, that survival alone was never enough. The cold, the hunger, the fear, these were tests not only of endurance, but of humanity. And he sometimes caught himself asking if he had enough left to remain human in a world that demanded cruelty to survive. One evening, he stumbled upon a small family, huddled in the remains of a collapsed home, shivering, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and despair. Lorenzo shared his meager rations, wrapped them in blankets he had scavenged, and for a fleeting moment he felt a spark of warmth, a reminder that life persisted despite the horrors. And yet, even in these quiet acts of mercy, he felt the shadow of everything he had done, everything he had failed to do, pressing against him like the winter wind. The war was drawing to a close, the Axis crumbling, Naples slowly reclaiming its voice, but Lorenzo realized that the end of fighting would not erase the weight of memory. Sitting alone atop a hill one night, the city glimmering faintly below him under the cold stars, he reflected on what survival had cost him: innocence, peace, certainty. The snow, though light, reminded him that life went on, that even after fire and blood, there was a chance to endure, to rebuild, to feel again. And in the silent expanse of winter, with the distant sound of artillery fading and the first signs of spring waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, Lorenzo Rossi understood that the true battle was not only for land or country, but for the human heart itself, to remain capable of hope, of love, and of mercy, even when everything else had been taken.
The final months of the war pressed down on Lorenzo like a storm that would not break. Every mission a test not only of skill, but of conscience. And though the Germans were retreating, resistance work had grown deadlier, each choice carrying weight that could not be measured in maps or orders. He led small teams through ruined villages, securing weapons caches, guiding civilians away from collapsing towns, and sabotaging the last remaining supply lines. But each success brought him no joy, only exhaustion, guilt, and the haunting memory of those who had fallen under his command. The skies above Naples, once a canvas of fear and fire, now seemed almost serene. Yet Lorenzo knew peace was an illusion. It was only a pause, a fragile breath between storms. One night, he and a small unit were tasked with disabling a German communications center on the outskirts of a partially abandoned town, a mission so dangerous that hesitation could mean death. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning timber, the streets littered with debris and the traces of hurried escape, and as they moved silently, Lorenzo felt the familiar tension in his chest, the combination of fear and purpose that had defined him since the desert, since the betrayal, since Naples. The building loomed ahead, dark and menacing, windows shattered, and inside, the hum of machinery reminded him that war never truly rests. He signaled, and his men followed, moving like shadows. And then chaos erupted, a single flare igniting the courtyard, German soldiers rushing from cover, gunfire tearing through the night. Lorenzo reacted instinctively, guiding his team with precision born of years in the cockpit and in the streets, each decision, life or death. Explosions shook the walls, smoke stung their eyes, and when it was over, the building was destroyed, but not without cost. 2 of his closest comrades lay wounded, one screaming in pain, the other silent, eyes wide in shock. And Lorenzo felt a familiar hollow echo inside him, a recognition that even victory was inseparable from loss. Returning through the ruined streets, he held his head high, but the weight of survival pressed against him like the winter he had endured, every heartbeat a reminder of what it meant to carry life and death in his hands. And yet, despite the horror, despite the guilt and the fatigue, there was a strange clarity in these final missions, that courage was not the absence of fear, that heroism was not the absence of loss, and that even in the smallest acts of defiance, they were shaping the end of the war not just for Italy, but for themselves. As dawn broke over the city, the smoke rising from smoldering ruins, mingling with the first light of spring, Lorenzo Rossi paused atop a hill overlooking the streets he had fought to protect, listening to the distant hum of life returning. And in that fragile, trembling moment, he allowed himself to imagine that the war might finally end, that he might finally lay down the weight he had carried for so long, and perhaps, just perhaps, reclaim some piece of the man he had once been before the bombs, the betrayal, and the desert.
The war was over, but the city of Naples still smelled of smoke, dust, and memories that refused to fade. Lorenzo Rossi walked through the streets, each step heavy with the ghosts of those he had lost and the weight of everything he had done to survive. Children ran past him, laughing, chasing balls through alleys scorched by artillery. Vendors called out their wares, and the air was alive with life that had returned despite everything. Lorenzo paused at a ruined piazza, the place where he had once flown above the city, watching it with detached eyes, and now he walked among it, his heart both broken and full. He saw faces that remembered him, strangers who had survived because of the missions he had led, and he nodded quietly, feeling the strange mix of relief and sorrow that came with survival. He stopped before the shattered walls of a church and touched a fragment of stained glass, blue and gold still catching the sunlight, and he realized that life, like the glass, could be fractured and still shine. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe fully, to hope, not for glory, not for recognition, but for a chance to live, to rebuild, and to carry forward what he had fought to protect. The Adriatic shimmered in the distance, waves reflecting the rising sun, and as he began to walk toward it, Lorenzo understood that the war had taken much from him: innocence, friends, certainty. But it had not taken his will, his conscience, or the fragile capacity to feel. Each step forward was heavy with memory, yes, but also light with the knowledge that survival was no longer enough. Now he could live, and that was the hardest, bravest act of all. And in that city, scarred and breathing, Lorenzo Rossi found the strange, enduring freedom of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in its possibility. And as he walked, the wind carried laughter, the sun carried hope, and for the first time he let himself feel that life could begin again.